Howdy, y'all. Today I'm going to be responding to one of the most bad faith arguments I hear parroted by conservatives every single time the subject of voter ID comes up, and that is the idea that those who oppose voter ID laws believe that black people are too stupid to obtain ID. Here's PragerU making the argument.
They argue, it's really a ruse to prevent blacks and other minorities from voting, since many of them just aren't capable of acquiring an ID. Can you get more condescending than that?
Here's Leo Terrell making the argument on Fox News.
She insulted every black American, any person of color, that they couldn't get an ID. I got tons of ID on me right now.
And here's Candace Owens making it in a debate with Hawk Newsome, the chairman of the NYC Black Lives Matter.
Because I want people that are hearing you to hear.
There are laws like you have to do 3 black flips, 2 somersaults, and a moonwalk.
You mean have an ID?
Yeah, an ID
so you,
or other forms.
Let me ask you a question.
Do
you think black people are too stupid to get a driver's license?
Why would you call black people?
Because to me, I'm offended that people call that.
Black.
No, I'm asking you something.
Black.
I'm asking you something. I'm offended when.
And if you want more examples, you can just check my Twitter mentions. So, is this true? Does the left oppose voter ID legislation because they think black people are stupid? Short answer, no. Long answer, first, let's look at why the left actually opposes these laws. So the basic idea behind voter ID laws is that you require government-issued photo ID in order for people to vote. This wouldn't be an issue if it weren't for the fact that 21 million Americans don't have photo ID. For context, that's the same as the population of Florida. And while we may be better off if all Floridians were barred from voting, it's not particularly democratic. And when we take a look at the demographics of people without ID, we can see why conservatives are so fond of these policies. According to a study by the Brennan Center for Justice, up to 25% of African American eligible voters may lack photo ID, compared to only 8% of white voters. Now, whenever proponents of voter ID have it brought up to them that there's millions of people without ID, they'll typically respond with something along the lines of, then they can just get one. It's free. But this just isn't true in many cases. Some states may offer free ID, but you need documents such as birth certificates, social security cards, and marriage licenses to obtain these IDs, and those documents cost money. Additionally, transportation is an expense and can be a major burden on the disabled, the elderly, and those without a car, especially if they live in rural areas. Many Texas residents need to travel up to 170 miles in order to obtain ID. And you've heard the saying, time is money. Well, people are having to take time off work to obtain all these documents, and in many cases, people need to obtain legal help to navigate the process. With all of these roadblocks, it's no wonder that in the Harvard Law School report, the high cost of free photo voter identification cards, the combined cost of obtaining photo ID is estimated to average around $75 to $175, with some cases going past $1,500. Just to reiterate how difficult and costly this process can be, we're going to go over the process Sherry Scramstead, a 70-year-old from Pennsylvania, had to go through to get her voter ID. First, she traveled to the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation in Scranton, where she was told she lacked the proper documentation to receive a photo ID because she did not have the marriage certificate to verify her name change. Looking for assistance, she contacted the governor's office, her state legislators, the state's Office of Aging, and her senators for assistance, but no one was able to help her. She then reached out to the Philadelphia Inquirer, which contacted a Department of Transportation spokesperson who put Ms. Scramstead in contact with Bernard Byros, the Northeast Pennsylvania director for the Department of Transportation. Mr. Byros arranged to resolve the problem once Scramstead returned to the Department of Transportation with a birth certificate. Scramstead ordered a birth certificate from New York and planned to then return to the Department of Transportation to receive a photo ID. Her costs for documents included a New York State birth certificate at $37.25, plus $15 priority shipping, so it would arrive in time for the election. for a total cost of $52.25. A copy of her marriage license cost another $10. She spent $16 on bus fare and 4 hours of her time, which amounts to $29 in potential wages, for a total of $107.25 for her free photo ID. It may almost be easier to do 3 backflips, 2 somersaults, and a moonwalk than to obtain an ID in some states. To say voter ID laws stop people from voting is not to say that the people prevented from voting are too stupid. This process is long, costly, and difficult. You could be the smartest person in the world, and you'd still have to come up with the money and the time to get your documents and get your ID. Because of this, it's no surprise that voter ID laws have been consistently shown to lower voter turnout, meaning tens of thousands of people who want to vote are turned away due to the burden these laws place on them. Now, conservatives may say that reduced voter turnout is worth it to ensure secure elections, but voter ID laws do virtually nothing to reduce voter fraud. This is because voter fraud is a virtually non-existent crime. A study of 2,068 alleged cases conducted by the News 21 Journalism Consortium found that since 2000, there have been only 10 cases of in-person voter fraud that could have been prevented by photo ID laws. 10 out of 146 million registered voters. This is a ratio of 1 case of voter fraud for every 14.6 million eligible voters. If you're an American, it is 6 times more likely that you've submitted a Wii Sports Resort speedrun than committed voter fraud. And it makes sense. If you're going to go to jail for 5 years, it shouldn't be for voter fraud. It should be for something cool like owning a pet lemur. So despite what they'll say about voter fraud and election integrity, these laws always come down to one thing: preventing primarily black people from voting. When we look at historical precedent, we can see how voter ID is not the first idea conservatives have had to keep black Americans from voting. But to learn more about that, we need to travel to before the Voting Rights Act. Now, time travel may seem unfeasible, but longtime viewers of the channel will note that I'm actually a god, so it's quite simple. And a 1, and a 2, and bam! We're in Reconstruction-era America. In 1870, the ratification of the 15th Amendment gave black Americans the right to vote. This was, of course, tremendously unpopular in the southern states, but also in many northern and western ones. Quick aside, a lot of the time U.S. history gets presented as all the racism being in the southern states, and while it was definitely prominent in the South, this was the 19th century. None of the states were good on race. So anyways, racists had an issue. They didn't want black people to vote, but they couldn't legally prohibit them from doing so. So they came up with ways to make it unfeasible for black Americans to vote, while not technically making it impossible. The first method was poll taxes. Any eligible voters were required to pay a tax. If they didn't, they couldn't cast their vote. Black voters tended to not have the money for this tax on account of the whole just gained their freedom and didn't really have the time to acquire generational wealth while they were working as slaves and sharecroppers thing. These taxes also would have kept many poor whites from voting, but the people who made these laws included a grandfather clause. This allowed people to bypass the tax if they had an ancestor who had voted prior to the Civil War. Naturally, this didn't help out black Americans because prior to the Civil War, black people couldn't vote. The other method was literacy tests. The officials in charge of voter registration mandated that an eligible voter must pass a test in order to vote. While this policy didn't explicitly target black voters, the officials would have broad discretion on how tests were administered. So while a white voter may only have to answer a simple question like, "Who is the president?" a black voter could have to answer several difficult questions like, if a state is party to a case, the Constitution provides that original jurisdiction shall be in blank, in an impossibly fast time. Also, it's worth remembering how recently these policies were around. The Voting Rights Act that outlawed them is younger than 79 members of Congress. Anyways, let's get back to the present day before I'm drafted for the Great War. So we can see how poll taxes and literacy tests are somewhat of a spiritual predecessor to the modern voter ID laws. All focus on making it far more difficult for Black people to vote, while not explicitly banning them from doing so. One could defend poll taxes and literacy tests in the same manner many defend voter ID. Do you think Black people are too poor to pay a tax? How condescending can you get? Oh, so Black people are too stupid to pass the little test? The left is so racist. Voter ID may be a recent push, but it's been the same idea for a century and a half. So to end this off, is there anything we can do about this argument? Well, I don't think conservatives are going to stop using it anytime soon. These pundits revel in bad faith argument, and from what I've seen, this one is very good at shutting down debate. Most liberals and leftists don't want to appear racist, so when conservatives just throw out accusations of racism and talk over any counter, it's not conducive to serious discussion. But I think what we've learned today is that the right will always do something as long as they can get away with it, whether it's suppressing the Black vote or trotting out the same tired gotchas. So don't let them get away with it. Whenever someone calls for voter ID, make sure you remind them just what that entails. The right will ask, does the left think Black people can't get IDs because they're stupid? But does the right think we're too stupid to recognize their racist attacks on Black voters? Thanks for watching.